5 takeaways from clean code. So the first one we're going to talk about is your names in your program or your variables or the labels that you use for values. They should describe intent. So here in this example, and I'm in a JavaScript file here, I have a constant called days and I assign it to the value of 12. But when just using days here, it doesn't really describe anything. It doesn't give days any context. Like if you're just reading this program, you wouldn't really know, like, is it days since someone did something? Is it days of the week? Like, what is this referring to? So potentially a better name for this would be days since completed survey. It describes a little bit of intent. It makes things more descriptive and gives a little bit more context to what this value is. So labels and variables in your program, make sure that they are a little bit more descriptive and describe some intent. Number 2, use one word for each concept that you use. So be consistent in your naming and labeling of certain things that you're doing in your program. So an example of this is you might have several areas in your program in which you get some data. So you might be calling an external API to get that data, or you might be calling your backend to get some data. And there's several conventions for calling these operations. So you might say it's get data or retrieve data or fetch data or something similar to this. And within your program, it's probably a good idea to just use a consistent naming convention for each one of these operations. So instead of having all these get data, retrieve data, fetch data, you might just use get data for all of them. So it could be get surveys, get survey answers, get survey questions, all those different things. Rather than using all these 3 different things, it might make someone read this and be like, so is this doing something else, or are they all doing the same consistent thing? So use one word for each concept. Number 3, use small functions that do one thing. And I am personally a React developer, and I think that this also applies to making sure that your React components, which are just JavaScript functions at the end of the day, they are small components that kind of just do one thing and they describe one part of your UI. And you really make sure to kind of componentize these. As if they're small functions that do one thing, it's probably going to make things more predictable in your program, make things easier to debug, make things easier to test, and overall be a more maintainable, extensible program. Number 4, don't write bad comments. And there's a few different subpoints on this. So number 1, don't comment bad code. Rewrite that code. As often, and I've done it myself, I've write some code that is, definitely a little bit hacky, and I'll just write a comment to say what the code does, when in reality, I probably should have rewritten that code to make it a little bit more self-describing and a little bit more self-evident, rather than just commenting that bad code. Also with this, make sure your comments are up to date. I have seen it several times in our professional code base in which there's a comment that refers to some library that we don't even use in our program anymore, and they're just way out of date and irrelevant comments. That just makes your code much more dirty or much less clean and is overall inaccurate and can lead to writing different bugs because you think that those comments are up to date. So make sure comments are up to date. Make sure your comments are actually needed. Like if you have a function that is labeled get data for surveys, you probably don't need a comment above that function that says this gets data for surveys. Like just avoid those redundant comments that are really not needed, as it just, like I said earlier, it adds more stuff overall within your code base, which just makes things a little bit less clean. And it also makes a developer just have more kind of mental overhead to parse those different comments as they're going through the code and stuff like that. All right, so make sure comments are not redundant and that they're actually needed. And then also, I know that this has definitely been a habit with some developers I've worked with, in which they will comment the start and end of a function. And one thing that's talked about in this book is that if you are finding yourself needing to comment the start and end of a function to make it clear where that function starts and ends, that's probably just an indicator that that function is way too large, or it's way too kind of messy of a function and it's just overall bad code. So one thing to look for is if you see these comments marking the start and end of a function, it might just be an indicator of a bad function that needs to be rewritten or broken out into several different functions, kind of going back into our third point here. And then number 5, instead of returning null, it's often better to throw an exception or an error. And what this is getting at is it avoids having a bunch of nulls kind of floating around in your program because you're returning them from your functions. And if you have a lot of nulls running around in your program, it can lead to potential bugs in which you try to access a property that's actually null, and then you try to call a function, but that property is null, and then you can get some errors when doing that. So here in this example, and this is not a well-labeled function or a well-labeled argument, this is just to show you the example here, but here I have an if check that basically checks, okay, if this argument here is a falsy value, then it basically returns null here. But you wouldn't want to do that. It might be better to, in JavaScript anyway, you could throw a new error here, and you could say arg1 is null or something like that. And you kind of throw just this loud exception that, hey, this argument is null, but it's not supposed to be null. All right. Now, of course, there's probably times in your program to where it's perfectly valid to have falsy values running around and you still check for those. But also in those situations, you might not just do an early return. You might just go down a different path in your program. All right. So instead of returning null, it's often better to just throw an error to kind of handle that rather than just having these nulls floating around in your program. So those are 5 takeaways from clean code. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you in that next one.